You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristadoulou, and a happy Thanksgiving to you all if you celebrate. Today, we are just a day away from nothing but football, from 1 p.m. Eastern all the way to somewhere probably around like 10:30 to 11 p.m. Eastern, as we're getting back-to-back-to-back matchups on Thanksgiving with NFL football. One of my favorite days of the football season, where you can just sit back and enjoy 3 games back-to-back-to-back without having to worry about another game going on. It's a beautiful time. We're going to dive in. We're going to make predictions. We're going to talk all these games. So as always, I invite you all to comment down below. Let me hear from you. Who do you like? Who do you dislike in these 3 games here? We'll also preview the Black Friday game separately on its own. I'll have also another preview video for all of the Sunday games. I'll have a Monday night matchup preview as well. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of that. You're going to see a lot of me this week with just how staggered all these games are. But we, of course, will dive in, beginning with, and a reminder before we get going, as always, nothing but a good time here. We're just here to make some predictions and talk the sport of football. No betting advice here. My record is purely straight up winners. Just talking football for fun here. Do with the information as you will. But starting with that first matchup, we got ourselves Green Bay going into Detroit to take on the Lions here. A matchup we saw back in week number 1 where, for the most part, Green Bay basically hammered the Lions. But both of these teams now at this stage in the season, that was quite a bit ago. We're talking, 11, 12 weeks at this point now. So vastly different teams in the way they're operating, whether it's through just what they're doing scheme-wise, what did and did not end up working for them as the season unfolded, injuries that they're facing. A lot has changed since then. And of course, you look at what Detroit is doing on the ground. Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, the ground and pound system that they have deployed there in Detroit for the better part of basically the entire Dan Campbell era. The Packers, with a really good run defense, are looking to try to shut things down once again, because the first time these two teams matched up, they held them to just 46 total yards of rushing on the ground. And if you look at Detroit's season so far, they are 0-4 in games where they do not run for north of 100 yards of rushing, and they are 7-0 when they go above 110 yards or more through the season. So it's all about running the football and keeping defenses honest with what Detroit likes to do offensively. The run game obviously opens up the play action passing and allows them to do some of the more fancy things they like to do through the passing attack. They're not a true just like drop back and pass team. We've seen Detroit lose games when they've gotten put into that situation. It typically leads to Jared Goff finding himself under a ton of pressure, getting sacked a lot. You basically can look at every loss except Kansas City as to how that sort of plays out when the run game gets shut down. So I think it's imperative for Green Bay's side to shut things down once again, but for Detroit's side to keep their offense fluid and moving, they've got to keep things going on the ground. And Green Bay's run defense, it's been pretty good for the most part this season, but the last month or so, it has been a little bit shaky. In their last 4 games, going in order from most recent to the furthest back, 94 yards allowed versus Minnesota, 142 yards allowed versus the Giants, 111 to Philadelphia, and then 163 to Carolina to go back their last 4 games here. Green Bay has been better. When you get into some of these next-gen stats, they've been better stopping runs heading to outside the tackles as opposed to in between the tackles, whereas Detroit, interestingly enough, averaging more yards per game on the ground going between the tackles as opposed to outside the tackles here. So maybe that's something that Detroit can keep in mind as they look to decide and dictate where they want to go with the football, especially when it comes to running the ball and what play design they decide to use. That being said, I also am a little bit concerned for Detroit, as it sounds like Graham Glasgow's availability for this game is a little bit up in the air. So a blow to the offensive line, obviously every single guy along there, is very important to what they like to do on the ground. And I mean, the way Green Bay's pass defense has been playing this season, it's one of those things where you don't want to see Detroit find themselves in a situation where they're just dropping back and passing the football. They've allowed 200 or more net passing yards only 5 times this season, and Rashawn Gary and Micah Parsons have been a pretty dynamic duo getting after the quarterback together, racking up 17.5 sacks together. And for a pass rush that's been slightly above average or so far this season for Green Bay, it feels like this could be a situation where Offensive line, a little bit weakened on Detroit's end. If they find themselves in a situation where Jared Goff's just kind of dropping back in passing because the run game gets wiped out again, it could get a little bit ugly. And you go back to that first matchup between the two teams, I think Green Bay got 3 sacks, if I'm remembering correctly. So you definitely want to make sure you can get that run game going. On the flip side, Green Bay, like I said, these teams looking vastly different from the way they matched up the first time around. Josh Jacobs' status currently up in the air for Thanksgiving on this one. Here, Emmanuel Wilson did a good job for the most part throughout the game. I believe it was 28 rushing attempts, 107 yards on the ground, give or take, something along those lines. So a solid job against Minnesota in place of Josh Jacobs last week for Emmanuel Wilson. But the offense, of course, runs through Jordan Love, his arm, and what he's able to do in the passing attack. And for a receiving room that is, it sounds like Jaden Reed is working his way back and Matt LaFleur is being coy and not really letting anybody know whether he's going to be available or not, telling them you'll basically find out on Thursday. You also have the question mark surrounding Matthew Golden's availability. He obviously missed last week's matchup against Minnesota, and because of the short week, it sounds like he may miss this one as well. As of me recording, this is all I know, so just keep that in mind. If something comes out while I'm recording or after the fact, I was not aware. It was not available to me at that point yet. And then, of course, ultimately losing Tucker Kraft to the IR, that is something that's also hurt this passing attack. So the passing game has maybe not been quite as explosive as this team would like it to be, again, because everything does go through Jordan Love at the end of the day in my eyes. And Detroit's pass defense has been pretty good, but they are a little bit banged up right now. Seems like safety Kirby Joseph is trending towards being out. On top of that, Terrion Arnold and his availability seems like it is up for questioning. And of course, you see the way this pass defense kind of fell apart last week against the Giants. 366 passing yards allowed to Jameis Winston, of all people. I am a little bit concerned about how this defense may look against Green Bay, but there is a lot going against Green Bay right now in terms of injuries and guys that are not going to be there or are potentially not going to be there and are probably going to have to wait like another week before they get back. I think both of these teams have their own flaws, especially health-wise, coming into this matchup here that could scare you in either direction. But ultimately, I think I am going to settle with the Detroit Lions on this one. This just kind of feels like one of those rivalries that's going to see a divisional split between the two. Home team wins the first game, home team wins the second game, and that's kind of how I'm seeing things play out here. I like the Lions something in the ballpark at 27-24. I really like the way the ground game is going for Detroit right now, and I think it's a really good test for Green Bay ultimately, but something just feels like series split for this one in my eyes, so I'll take the Lions on Thanksgiving, a team that's always there on Thanksgiving and always fun to watch. And this matchup historically on Thanksgiving too, always a really good time as well. But I think the Lions by a hair here, 3-point win for the team. Looking at the next one, midday matchup here, Chiefs and Cowboys. This is the game where everyone's going to be starting to fall into that coma. Now, I will say this. The Chiefs offense definitely has their work cut out for them. And the reason for that is because the Cowboys obviously made some moves at the trade deadline to try and shore up the defense, bringing in Quillen and Williams, and then they, went to the bye week and kind of disappeared right after the trade deadline. Well, since their return from the trade deadline, this team is 2-0, and they've allowed 16 and 12 points allowed in those last two games that they've played, both being their two lowest point totals allowed of the season. On top of that, only allowing 90 rushing yards total between these last 2 weeks. There is a potential that maybe this defense has figured something out. I do still think there are some concerns with the pass defense and them being able to slow down quarterbacks. And when you look at the 90 yards rushing, I'm sure somebody will point and go, well, one of those games is against the Raiders. Well, they still allowed only 63 yards to the Philadelphia Eagles. So I do think that there is still something to be said about what potentially might be a little bit of a defensive turnaround, at least against the run. And and for this time of year, for the games you're going to find yourself in, that's kind of what you want to be able to do, is stop the run. So this is kind of perfect timing if they figured this out here, because the run defense going into the bye week was not very good. So we're in a good spot here for Dallas's defense, I guess, somewhat. But like I said, Kansas City coming in, they could pose a challenge in their own right. Coming off of nearly 500 yards of offense against the Indianapolis Colts last week in Arrowhead. I mean, Patrick Mahomes currently averaging the most passing yards per game right now. He doesn't lead the league in yards, but he leads the league in yards per game at 271 yards per. With a string of tougher games against Buffalo and Denver prior to last week's bounce back, I'll be interested in seeing how this offense continues to look moving forward. It seems like they may have found a bit of a rhythm last week against the Colts, and for what it's worth, the Colts secondary does have some pretty big names in that secondary, and I was pretty surprised to see them put up the numbers that they did. I understand, obviously, they had to go into overtime for that, but I mean, I don't really think that added to the total that much when things were all said and done. And with the way that the Kansas City Chiefs have kind of gotten some inconsistent play, and albeit a part of it because of the injuries that they've been dealing with in the running back room, they haven't necessarily gotten the best production from their running backs. And typically when Patrick Mahomes ends up being the leading rusher for the team, they wind up losing the contest more often than they win. So I definitely expect that Kansas City's going to come in, acknowledge what this defense has at least done the last couple of weeks since that bye week and trade deadline and improving that run defense, and try to challenge them through the air. That is the known weakness of this Dallas Cowboys defense, and I do think that the Chiefs have an opportunity to move the football through the air, of course, with Patrick Mahomes piloting the way, and Rashee Rice, since his return from suspension, has been pretty damn good so far. On the flip side, the Chiefs, I'm very curious to see how Steve Spagnuolo and this defense goes about trying to handle the dynamic duo of George Pickens and CeeDee Lamb. What they are starting to do together as a duo is becoming problematic for defenses to deal with. Now, I've always looked at George Pickens as a legit wide receiver one, and I understand the thoughts on his personality and how he was handling himself in Pittsburgh is one thing, but I think when you look at George Pickens just as a player, wide receiver one, and you see some of the numbers he put up with the quarterback situation that he was dealing with over the last few years in Pittsburgh, I'm not really surprised that he gets a quarterback like Dak Prescott, and now he's basically he's on par, if not even playing better than CeeDee Lamb is with Dak Prescott right now. So you have two guys currently, legitimate wide receiver ones on just about any team that they would go to, and each guy is good for potentially 100 yards and a score, give or take, depending on the day. One or the other is going to get there. The other person's going to be flirting with at least 100 yards, if not maybe getting there. You have a pretty good pass defense in Kansas City coming up here, though. Roughly ranked within the upper third of the NFL, but we've seen quarterbacks like Justin Herbert, like Josh Allen, give them some problems and pass for a decent yardage total north of 250, 260 yards or more. I mean, you look at even Bo Nix just a few weeks ago putting up 295 through the air against this defense. So there have been some opportunities for quarterbacks to move the football, and they've been able to do so successfully, and it's amongst the better names in the NFL, Bo Nix aside, because I feel like that conversation is still very much open, and a lot of people are not going to entertain the idea of Bo Nix being in the upper echelon yet, and I get it. But that being said, you're also prepping for a running back in Javonte Williams as well, fifth in rushing, averaging 5 yards per attempt. I mean, you need to be able to mitigate something, and I think with the way that Dallas has kind of handled themselves this year, especially offensively, they like to have a good balanced attack. So if you can shut one side down or the other, you can find yourself in a position to beat this team. Because when you look at Dallas's losses so far this season, you go through them and you can kind of scrape through some of the numbers. Typically one aspect of the offense typically tends to struggle, and that amounts to the loss that they find themselves in. Like, you go back to Philadelphia week 1, could not really throw the football. You go back to their loss against Carolina, could not run the football. You go back to their game against Arizona, could not really throw the football extremely effectively. They've also been prone to some turnovers. You look at the game against Chicago, where Dallas ended up turning the ball over 4 times. That ultimately cost them in a 1-possession contest. Their game against Arizona as well, they also had 3 turnovers. So if you can put them into a situation where the offense becomes one-dimensional, you tend to see them come away with a loss. So I do think there is opportunities there for Kansas City. There is the one thing, though, that does have me a bit worried about this matchup, and that's just Kansas City and their inability to win on the road. They are 1-4 in games on the road right now, whereas Dallas at home, 3-1-1, so they've done a pretty good job of protecting their house. Kansas City basically winning football games in Arrowhead, and that's about it for the most part. So this one's a tough one here, but the football guy in me says that Kansas City is probably the better team here, because I still don't know if I trust this Dallas defense. Whereas when I look at the Kansas City offense and some of the ups and downs we've seen from them this season, I don't know if I trust them quite as much as the potential boom that this Dallas Cowboys offense can have, being piloted by Dak Prescott, and the threat at wide receiver, and what they've been getting from Javonte Williams out of the backfield this year has been phenomenal. It's a tough one. It's a toss-up. But after seeing what Kansas City was able to do last week against Indianapolis, and a team that is very much one of the top teams in the AFC, whereas with Dallas, I mean, we've seen some of their wonky struggles with some of the better teams that they've faced. And I mean, yes, massive win coming off against the Philadelphia Eagles this past week, but that game, they dug themselves into a serious hole before getting themselves out of it, and an ultimate offensive collapse on Philadelphia's end. I think I trust the Chiefs a little bit more here, so I am going to go Kansas City, but I'm going to have them winning 24-23. That's kind of where that's how I'm going to show my uncertainty, I guess, with this game here. So I just don't quite know who really does come away with the win here, but I'm erring on the side of I trust the quarterback, the system, the defense a little bit more in Kansas City. Yes, it's on the road. Yes, they're 1-4, and that definitely scares me, but I think I'm going to trust in Mahomes, Reed, and that defense over there led by Spagnuolo just a bit more than that Dallas Cowboys team. So give me the Chiefs 24-23, tight, fun contest for the midday. And then by the time that wraps up, you should be waking up from your midday coma, and we'll have ourselves a nice Bengals and Ravens Thursday night matchup. This one, I believe, starts at 8:20 Eastern is what I'm remembering correctly. Joe Burrow making his long-awaited return for the Bengals here, going into Baltimore to take on the Ravens. First start since week number 2, where he exited the game, where the Bengals ultimately actually came away with a wild win over the Jaguars. But Jamar Chase also making his return from a 1-game suspension. However, T. Higgins will be out for this contest here because of the concussion that he sustained against New England. Sounds like he's well into the thick of the protocol at this point here, and he will not make it out in time for this game tomorrow. Baltimore's defense since week 6 has been a bit of a problem, and that's kind of where I start with this football game here, because if you go back to their game against the Rams, they only lost that contest 17-3, and ultimately Lamar Jackson, of course, was still not back yet. But their defense has turned into a problem because since that matchup, they've allowed no more than 19 points in a game. And their defense also in that same span has 11 total takeaways. So they've been forcing turnovers. They've been keeping teams out of the end zone, forcing them to settle for 3 at best. And on top of that, their run defense so far, only 2 games over 100 yards rushing in that same exact span. So they've buckled down on the run. They're buckling down in the red zone. They're not letting teams get into scoring position. It's been a hell of a turnaround for this Ravens defense since they started getting healthy. I am keeping an eye on the availability of Kyle Hamilton. It seems like there's some uncertainty surrounding him with the short week. Did not participate Monday, limited on Tuesday. Do not know if he's going to be available quite just yet. That information isn't available to me, so definitely something worth keeping an eye on. However, despite how good this Ravens defense is right now and how good this Ravens defense has been basically for the duration of Joe Burrow's career, Joe Burrow typically finds success against the Baltimore Ravens. It's just kind of been a part of his career where he has 21 touchdowns to 5 interceptions through the air. He has been able to torch Baltimore no matter how good their defense is. And now they've had some flaws depending on the season, but we have seen Joe Burrow have a lot of success. You got to go back to like the really early days of his career to find bad games against Baltimore for Joe Burrow. However, this could be a little bit different though. Rusty, coming off a long stretch and an injury. This is a really tough situation to come back and play, but I like and respect the willingness, despite being 3-8 with playoffs basically out of the picture, that he's willing to come in and fight to the very end of this season here. On the other side, the Ravens offense themselves hasn't necessarily been the greatest to watch. The last 3 games have been a little bit of a tough one to kind of digest if you're a Ravens fan, at least offensively. It took them until the third quarter last week against the Jets to actually get themselves into the end zone and finally get scoring. And then you just look back at the last 3 games or so, it's been a really tough time. And I know you've played, the Jets, the Browns have a good defense as well, but even the week prior to that too, it took a little bit to really put some separation between you and the Vikings. So Cincinnati's defense should be a good opportunity for a get-right game. Once again, Trey Hendrickson sounds like he's not going to be available based off what Zach Taylor said on Monday, so you obviously don't have to worry about him. The pass rush in Cincinnati has been nearly non-existent. It is not a great unit to watch. And on top of that, nobody's given up more points per game this season than the Cincinnati Bengals, sitting at 32.7 points per game, which is about 4 and some change more than the next team behind them in second place. Now, they did tighten up a little bit last week against New England. There was a lot of conversation around whether New England was taking that game as maybe seriously as they should be. I don't want to discredit Cincinnati's defense by any means. It's just stuff I've been hearing. But overall, I think that this is a good opportunity for the Ravens to have a good bounce back and strong performance offensively, because I definitely think they need it. They're the worst team. They're the worst pass defense in the NFL right now. They're also the second worst run defense on top of that, and that's all in terms of yards per game allowed. They're the second worst third down defense. They're the 5th worst red zone defense. If there was ever a game for Lamar Jackson, for Derrick Henry, for this Ravens offense as a whole to find themselves and get themselves ready to make a legitimate run, as they're currently riding this 5-game winning streak, but they have themselves a lot of work to do to make sure they can secure that AFC North win. This is the game for them to turn things around and get themselves moving in a positive direction. I like the Ravens in this one. I think they get the job done. However, I don't think that the Ravens just run away with this contest. I expect that it's going to be a fun, explosive affair. I think Joe Burrow, he could be a little bit rusty, but with how good he is at what he does, yes, you still have T. Higgins. I am concerned about yes, you have Jamar Chase. I am concerned about not having T. Higgins along there, but Burrow and Chase's connection is one that is very special and not like a lot of others in the NFL, so I expect them to challenge Baltimore. I'll be curious to see what they can do on the ground as well. Ultimately, Baltimore's run defense, like I said, a really good unit here, but I think we get a higher scoring contest, 31-27. Bengals make the Ravens sweat a bit here, and ultimately you kind of say goodbye to potential playoff chances with another loss for Cincinnati, and the Ravens basically grab firm control of the AFC North, because I'm a little bit concerned about what this Pittsburgh Steelers looks like going into their matchup in Week 13, and obviously we will get to that when we do. But those are my thoughts going into Thanksgiving Day and the 3 matchups we have there. Like I said, make sure you're subscribed so you do not miss. I'm going to have a preview for the Black Friday game as well. I'll have a preview for all of Sunday's games. I'll have a preview for Monday's matchup as well, so do not miss out on any of that fun content. Comment down below. Let me hear from you. Who you like, who you dislike, why, do you agree, do you disagree, anything else you want to add to what I broke down, fire away and let me hear from you. But as always, if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it, and I will see you all tomorrow for a Black Friday preview. Have a good one.